Murder on the Mississippi, the thrilling life and shocking death of Colonel Davenport. If you stand on Arsenal Island today, it's easy to miss how much history is buried there. It's a quiet place now. But in the early 19th century, this island was the center of everything: trade, war, and frontier politics. And one man stood at the center of it all. His name was George Davenport. Before Rock Island was a city, before it even had a name, George Davenport was already here. He wasn't born an American. He was born in England, in Lincolnshire, in 1783. His early life reads like a novel. As a young man, he worked as a merchant sailor, traveling between European ports. At one point, he was imprisoned in Russia for an entire winter, held in St. Petersburg under harsh conditions. Somewhere along the way, he changed his name from John King to George Davenport. No one quite knows why. By 1806, he had decided to start over completely. He came to the United States and joined the U.S. Army, serving for 10 years. He fought in the War of 1812, including some of its bloodiest engagements. When his service ended, Davenport didn't head back east. He went west as far as the frontier would allow. In the spring of 1816, he arrived at Rock Island with an Army supply expedition. The Army was building Fort Armstrong at a strategic bend in the Mississippi River on what would later be known as Arsenal Island. Fort Armstrong was built as part of the United States' effort to assert control over the upper Mississippi River after the War of 1812. Located on a limestone ridge at the southern end of Arsenal Island, the fort overlooked a narrow stretch of river known as the Rock Island Rapids, one of the most important choke points on the Mississippi. From this position, soldiers could monitor river traffic, protect supply lines, and assert federal authority into a region still shaped by native land claims, British influence, and fur trade rivalries. The fort was named after Secretary of War John Armstrong and was constructed largely of local stone, giving it a permanence meant to signal that the U.S. presence was not temporary. The fort quickly became a hub for diplomacy, trade, and settlement, drawing traders, interpreters, and civilians into its orbit. Treaties were negotiated there, supplies were exchanged, and relationships were forged with the Sauk, Meskwaki, and other native nations whose lands surrounded it. When George Davenport arrived with an Army supply expedition, he was stepping into what would become the nucleus of the Quad Cities. Fort Armstrong anchored federal power on the island, and Davenport's nearby log cabin became the civilian counterpart. Together, they formed the fixed point from which Rock Island, and eventually the wider region, began to take shape. The frontier suited him. Davenport became a trader and moved easily between cultures. He expanded fur trading networks across the upper Mississippi Valley and was trusted by nearly everyone who dealt with him. Among native peoples, he was known by the Winnebago name Saganosh, meaning the Englishman. While relations between native nations and American authorities grew more hostile, Davenport managed something rare: genuine trust. He traveled regularly to native villages, trading provisions for furs. He was described as generous, jovial, and deeply social. He loved company. He loved telling stories, and native leaders noticed the difference between him and the military officers stationed nearby. Most notably, he formed a deep and lasting friendship with Black Hawk. The two men visited each other's homes. They talked, they debated, they disagreed. But Black Hawk saw in Davenport a sense of fairness and humanity that stood in sharp contrast to the system closing in around his people. That tension exploded in 1832 with the Black Hawk War, a brutal conflict driven by broken treaties and the forced removal of the Sauk people from their long-established village of Saukenuk. During the war, George Davenport was one of the most influential figures along the upper Mississippi and consistently tried to prevent the conflict from turning violent. A longtime trader, interpreter, and intermediary with deep personal ties to the Sauk people, Davenport believed the crisis could be resolved without war when Sauk families, led by Black Hawk, returned to their homeland near Saukenuk. He urged restraint and negotiation, arguing that the return was not a military invasion, but an attempt to reclaim ancestral land after years of broken treaties. When fighting broke out anyway, Davenport was given the honorary rank of colonel by Illinois authorities, not as a battlefield commander, but as a trusted organizer and advisor. His role focused on logistics, communication, and mediation where possible, and he continued to warn against reprisals and escalation. Once fear and militia violence took over, however, Davenport had little power to stop events. By the end of the war, the Sauk had been decisively defeated. Saukenuk was permanently lost, and Black Hawk himself was captured. Davenport, who had spent decades living among native people and working alongside them, was left to watch the destruction of a world he believed could have ended differently. In 1835, he partnered with another pioneer, Russell Farnham, an early upper Mississippi trader and land speculator who arrived in the region in the first wave of settlement after the Black Hawk War to establish a settlement called Farnhamsburg. Although Farnham never achieved Davenport's prominence, he helped survey land and organize early development, and his role was significant enough that the town initially bore his name. The settlement was later renamed Stevenson in honor of Winfield Scott, the prominent U.S. Army general and national figure of the era, before finally becoming Rock Island in 1841. The new name tied the town's identity to what became Arsenal Island, long recognized by traders, river pilots, and the military, and increasingly important as the site of a growing federal presence. Davenport became the town's first postmaster, placing him at the center of its earliest civic life. Across the river, he also helped found the city that still bears his name, Davenport, and was involved in early planning for rail connections and river commerce that would soon reshape the entire region. By 1833, Davenport had built a large federal-style home on the lower part of Arsenal Island near the old fort. It was one of the westernmost examples of that architectural style in the country. The house stood alone, overlooking the river, surrounded by trees and reputation. He was wealthy, or at least everyone believed he was. Rumors spread that Davenport kept tens of thousands of dollars locked in a safe inside his home. On the frontier, that kind of rumor could be deadly. His personal life was complicated, and by modern standards, deeply troubling. Davenport fathered several children out of wedlock, including 2 with his teenage stepdaughter. Another child was born to a seamstress at Fort Armstrong, and there were long-standing rumors of additional children with Native American women. This was widely known, rarely discussed, and largely tolerated at the time. One of his sons, who was named Bailey, would later become mayor of Rock Island during the Civil War. Then came the 4th of July, 1845. While the town celebrated Independence Day across the river, a group of men saw opportunity. They believed Davenport's house would be empty. They believed the safe would be full. They rowed across the Mississippi and broke in. But Colonel Davenport hadn't gone to the picnic. He wasn't feeling well, and he decided to return home. Colonel Davenport walked in on the burglars. They shot him in the leg, tied him up, and forced him to open the safe. Inside, they found less than $400. Denied the fortune they expected, they dragged the 62-year-old man into his bedroom. They beat him unconscious. They stole his watch, a chain, a gold piece, and a gun. Then they fled, leaving him for dead on the floor of his own home. Hours later, passers-by heard his cries for help. A doctor was rushed over from the celebration. Davenport was revived just long enough to give a clear description of his attackers. He died that night. 5 men were charged with his murder. 1 escaped and was never found. Another had his sentence commuted to life in prison. The rest were convicted and, after years of appeals, taken to the yard of the Rock Island County Jail in downtown Rock Island. There, before a massive crowd drawn from both sides of the river, they were hanged. Wagons, horses, and riverboats carried spectators in from miles away. It became one of the largest public gatherings the region had yet seen, a grim moment when frontier justice played out in full view of the community. Davenport was first buried near his home under a large oak tree, a site marked with Native American rights honoring a man many considered a friend. Years later, his remains were moved to Chippeanic Cemetery, where a stone obelisk still marks his grave. A friend later said that Davenport never sued anyone in his life, that he couldn't bear to see someone in distress without trying to help. Whether traveling on a steamboat or staying at a hotel, he was always surrounded by people listening to his stories. He had worked his entire life to build something permanent, a town, a home, a legacy, and he was killed for a fortune that never existed. After his death, his house took on a strange afterlife. During the Civil War, it served as headquarters for a Confederate prisoner of war camp on the Arsenal. Later, it fell into disrepair. By the late 1800s, large portions were torn down, leaving only the central structure. But history has a way of circling back. In the late 20th century, the house was restored, the missing wings were rebuilt. Today it stands again on Arsenal Island, much as it once did. The man who helped build Rock Island died alone on the 4th of July, betrayed by rumor and greed. But his mark on the Quad Cities never disappeared. It's still here, in the cities, in the river crossings, and on the island where it all began.